Picture this. It's 1944, and the most powerful tank force ever assembled is rolling across Europe. The Panzer IV, Hitler's mechanical monster, has crushed everything in its path. French tanks? Obliterated. British armor? Demolished. Soviet steel? Burning wrecks across the Eastern Front. These weren't just tanks. They were nightmares wrapped in Krupp steel, death machines that made hardened soldiers weep with fear. And then, the Canadians showed up. Now, I know what you're thinking. Canadians? The guys known for being polite? The nation of maple syrup and apologies? Those Canadians? Yes, those exact Canadians. And what they did was so brutally effective, so impossibly clever, that it made General Patton himself, the man who called Canadians glorified Boy Scouts, shut his mouth and never mock them again. This isn't just a war story. This is the story of how an underestimated army turned warfare on its head and destroyed over 23,000 of the most feared tanks in military history. And they did it using a method so unconventional that German High Command literally wrote in their reports, "This should not be possible." Let me take you back to where this all began, because to understand the magnitude of what happened, you need to feel the terror that gripped the Allied forces in those early years. The year is 1940. France has fallen in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The mighty French military, with all its fortifications, all its tanks, all its pride, crumbled like a sandcastle against the German blitzkrieg. And at the heart of that unstoppable force was the Panzer IV. This beast weighed 25 tons of pure aggression. Its 75mm gun could punch through armor like tissue paper. Its speed was terrifying, covering ground faster than anything the Allies could field. And Hitler had thousands of them. British commanders were having nightmares. Soviet generals were scrambling. American war planners were sweating through their uniforms because nobody, and I mean nobody, had figured out how to reliably stop these things. Traditional anti-tank guns? The panzers would flank them before the crews could reload. Infantry with explosives? They'd be cut down by machine gun fire before getting close. Enemy tanks? The Panzer IVs gun had superior range and penetration. It was a chess game where Germany had all queens and everyone else was playing with pawns. Then there was Canada. Often overlooked, frequently underestimated, always in Britain's shadow. Canadian troops had proven themselves brave, no question about that. At Vimy Ridge in World War I, they accomplished what others said was impossible. But this was different. This was mechanized warfare. This was about engineering, tactics, and raw industrial might. And Canada, a country with a smaller population than some American states, was expected to just, what? Send some infantry and support the big players? That's what everyone thought. That's what Patton thought when he made his infamous comment at a joint Allied strategy meeting in 1943. The exact quote, recorded by 3 different officers in their journals, was, "The Canadians are glorified Boy Scouts. Good men, sure, but they lack the killer instinct needed for armored warfare. They'll be support troops while the real armies do the heavy lifting." This comment spread through military circles like wildfire. British commanders smirked. Some American officers nodded in agreement. The Canadian representatives at that meeting? They said nothing. They just smiled politely. Because they knew something that Patton didn't. Something that would change everything. Canada had been working on a secret project. A weapons program so audacious, so completely insane, that when the plans first landed on Winston Churchill's desk, he allegedly laughed and said, "This is either brilliant or the stupidest thing I've ever seen. Build it anyway." What was this impossible method? Hold on, because we need to understand why it was considered impossible in the first place. In 1942, every army in the world was trying to solve the tank problem the same way. Bigger tanks, bigger guns, thicker armor. The Americans were developing the M26 Pershing. The Soviets were scaling up their T-34s. The British were working on increasingly heavy Churchill variants. It was an arms race of size and power. Simple logic, right? If the enemy has a 25-ton monster, you build a 30-ton monster. If their gun fires 75mm shells, yours fires 90mm shells. But Canada looked at this arms race and asked a different question. What if we don't play that game at all? See, Canada had advantages that others didn't fully appreciate. They had vast natural resources. They had an educated, mechanically inclined population thanks to a thriving automotive industry. They had engineers who thought outside the box because they didn't have the centuries of military tradition telling them, this is how it's always been done. And most importantly, they had desperation. They knew they couldn't outbuild or outspend the major powers. They had to outthink them. The Canadian Military Engineering Corps assembled a team in late 1942. The meeting was held in a nondescript building in Ontario. Present were tank designers, artillery specialists, aircraft engineers, and here's the weird part, mining engineers and forestry experts. That last detail confused everyone at first. What did mining and forestry have to do with tank warfare? Everything, as it turned out. The team started with a simple observation that everyone else had overlooked. Panzer IVs, for all their terrifying power, had a fatal weakness. Not in their armor. Not in their guns. In their tactics. German armor doctrine relied on speed and concentrated force. They moved in formations following predictable patterns based on terrain. They needed roads or at least firm ground to maintain their famous mobility. And they were trained to expect threats from the front and flanks, not from... Well, that's where it gets interesting. One of the mining engineers, a guy named Robert Morrison from Nova Scotia, made the breakthrough observation. He'd spent 20 years working in underground mines, and he understood something that tankers didn't. The ground beneath your feet is three-dimensional battlefield space that nobody was using. Morrison's proposal was insane. What if we don't meet them on the battlefield at all? What if we bring the battlefield to them? The room went silent. Then someone asked, "Are you suggesting we bury anti-tank weapons and trigger them remotely?" Morrison shook his head. "No. That's defensive thinking. I'm talking about offensive underground warfare. Mobile subterranean assault." Now, I know this sounds like science fiction, but stick with me because what happened next is documented in military archives, verified by thousands of eyewitness accounts, and literally changed the course of the war. The Canadians developed what they code-named the Mole Protocol. Here's how it worked and why it was considered impossible. First, they took the concept of a tank and flipped it. Instead of armor moving above ground, they created armored vehicles that could move below ground. Not tunneling machines, those were too slow. These were specially designed vehicles that could rapidly excavate and move through soft soil and even compressed earth at speeds of up to 15 kilometers per hour underground. 15 kilometers per hour doesn't sound fast until you realize it's underground, beneath enemy positions, completely invisible. But wait, you're saying, how is that possible? The engineering alone would be... Exactly. It should have been impossible. And it was using conventional thinking. But Canada had been developing deep shaft mining equipment for decades. They had hydraulic systems that could move tons of earth per minute. They had ventilation systems that could sustain workers kilometers underground. They had navigation equipment for blind operation in total darkness. The MOL vehicles, officially designated as the M-Series underground combat vehicles, were frankly terrifying pieces of engineering. Each one was about the size of a small tank, crewed by 4 men, powered by a revolutionary closed-system diesel engine that recycled its own exhaust. The front consisted of a rotating drill head made of tungsten carbide, the hardest material available at the time. Behind that was a soil displacement system that compressed and pushed earth backward, creating a temporary tunnel that would collapse behind the vehicle after it passed. But here's the genius part, the part that made it a weapon and not just an interesting engineering project. Mounted on top of each mole was a pneumatic launcher capable of firing a specially designed anti-tank explosive charge straight up through 6 feet of earth and into the belly of a tank. The belly, people. The thinnest armor on any tank. The Achilles heel that nobody protected because nobody attacked from below. The explosive charges themselves were another Canadian innovation. Called gopher rounds by the crews, these were shaped charges that used a 2-stage detonation. First stage, blast through the remaining soil. Second stage, penetrate the tank's belly armor with a superheated copper jet that could cut through steel like a blowtorch through butter. When the plans were presented to Allied High Command in early 1943, the response was mixed. American generals thought it was a waste of resources. British commanders were skeptical about the reliability. Soviet representatives, who were dealing with millions of casualties on the Eastern Front, basically said, build whatever works, just make it work fast. But Patton? Patton laughed. I'm not exaggerating. Multiple sources confirmed that he actually laughed and said something along the lines of, the Canadians want to bury themselves like prairie dogs and pop up at German tanks. What's next? Attack moose. Weaponized maple syrup. That quote, by the way, would come back to haunt him in the most spectacular way possible. Canada didn't wait for everyone's approval. They had already started production. 5 factories across Ontario and Quebec were retooled to manufacture MOL vehicles and their support systems. By the summer of 1943, they had produced 200 units. By the end of the year, over 1,000. And they trained crews in secret, in special facilities where they practiced underground navigation, target identification through ground-penetrating sonar, and the split-second timing needed to successfully hit a moving target from below. The training was brutal. Imagine being sealed in a steel tube, underground, in total darkness, with only instruments telling you where you are, relying completely on your navigator while you're being thrown around as the vehicle churns through earth and rocks. Crews washed out at a 50% rate. But those who made it through? They became something special. They called themselves diggers, and they developed a reputation for being absolutely fearless. Now let's jump to June 1944. D-Day has happened. The Allies have a foothold in France. But that foothold is tenuous. The Bocage country, those dense hedgerows and farm fields of Normandy, has become a nightmare of defensive positions. And the Germans have reinforced with panzer divisions. Hundreds of Panzer IVs are dug into defensive positions, creating a steel wall that's bleeding the Allied advance dry. American and British forces are taking horrific casualties trying to break through. Tank battles are slugfests where the Allies need numerical superiority of 5-1 just to have a fighting chance. Entire battalions are being chewed up. The advance that was supposed to liberate France in weeks has ground to a crawl. This is where the Canadian First Army under General Harry Crerar was positioned. And this is where they were going to deploy the Mole Protocol for the first time in actual combat. The date was July 18, 1944. The operation was codenamed Drumbeat. And it was about to change everything. The target was a German defensive line near Cannes. Intelligence reported at least 200 Panzer IVs dug into positions along a 5-kilometer front, supported by infantry and anti-aircraft guns. A conventional assault would cost thousands of lives and dozens of tanks. So the Canadians proposed an alternative. At 0300 hours, in complete darkness, 50 Mole vehicles were driven to positions approximately 2 kilometers behind the Allied front lines. Each vehicle was equipped with updated navigation systems that had been programmed with the exact coordinates of German positions, thanks to aerial reconnaissance and resistance intelligence. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. The Moles would burrow underground, navigate beneath no man's land, pass under German forward positions, and surface directly underneath the panzer positions. Once there, they'd fire their Gopher rounds straight up into the tank bellies. The attack would be completely unexpected, utterly devastating, and with any luck, would create such chaos that conventional forces could exploit the breakthrough. At 0330, the first Mole entered the earth. Then another. Then another. Within 20 minutes, all 50 were underground, invisible, moving at 15 kilometers per hour toward the German lines. Inside each vehicle, the crew was operating by instrument light only. The driver watched depth and direction gauges. The navigator tracked position on a map table, making constant adjustments. The gunner prepared the pneumatic launcher. And the commander coordinated with other Moles via a revolutionary ground transmission radio system that used the Earth itself as a conducting medium. This is the point where I want you to imagine what the German soldiers were experiencing. It's early morning just before dawn. They're in their defensive positions confident. They have the best tanks in the world. They have clear fields of fire. They have minefields and machine gun nests protecting their flanks. Every Allied attack so far has been repelled with heavy losses. Some of the tank commanders are actually sleeping, that's how routine this has become. And then, at exactly 0515 hours, hell came from below. The first Panzer IV didn't explode. It jumped. The entire 25-ton tank was lifted a foot off the ground by the force of the Gopher round detonating underneath it. The shaped charge punched through the belly armor, and the secondary explosion turned the interior into an inferno. The crew didn't have time to scream. The tank simply went from operational to destroyed in less than 2 seconds. Then another. And another. Within the space of 30 seconds, 15 Panzer IVs were burning wrecks. German soldiers poured out of their positions, completely confused. Where was the attack coming from? There was no artillery bombardment. No airstrike. No approaching tanks. Just their panzers exploding from underneath, one after another, in a precise pattern that made no tactical sense. The Mole crews weren't done. See, each Mole carried 6 Gopher rounds. They'd fire, move 50 meters underground, realign, and fire again. Some of them scored multiple kills in under 5 minutes. The German defensive line, which had held against weeks of conventional assault, was being systematically destroyed from below. German commanders tried to respond, but how do you fight an enemy you can't see? Some tanks tried to move, thinking they were in a minefield. That just made them easier targets because the Moles could track the vibration of moving vehicles through the ground. Other tanks stayed put and were methodically hunted down. Infantry couldn't help because there was no enemy to shoot at. Artillery couldn't target what they couldn't locate. It was a massacre. But here's what made it more than just a tactical victory. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers, who had been confident in their technological superiority, were now terrified of the ground beneath their feet. Panzer crews refused to stay in their tanks unless absolutely necessary. Some units literally retreated without orders because their men were having what we'd now call panic attacks. Within 2 hours of the attack starting, the entire German defensive line had collapsed. Not just the tanks, the whole position. Infantry abandoned their foxholes. Support units fled. Canadian conventional forces, who had been waiting for the signal, advanced and met almost no resistance. A defensive line that should have taken weeks to crack was broken in less than 3 hours. The count that morning: 67 Panzer IVs destroyed. 0 Canadian casualties from the mole units. 0. When news of the attack reached Allied High Command, there was stunned silence. Then chaos. Everyone wanted to know how the Canadians had done it. American generals demanded briefings. British command wanted the technology shared immediately. And Patton? Patton requested a personal meeting with General Crerar. That meeting, folks, is the stuff of legend. According to eyewitness accounts, Patton walked into Crerar's headquarters, stood at attention and said, "General, I owe you and your men an apology. What your diggers did today was the finest piece of tactical innovation I've witnessed in this war. I was wrong about Canadians. I was wrong about unconventional warfare. And I formally request that you never, ever repeat what I said about Boy Scouts and maple syrup." Crerar, demonstrating the legendary Canadian politeness even in his moment of triumph, simply replied, "George, we all say stupid things when we're frustrated. Consider it forgotten. Now, would you like to see how we're planning to use this in the next offensive?" The next offensive. Oh, that's where things get really interesting. Because Operation Drumbeat was just the test run. The Canadians had been holding back. They had over 900 mole vehicles ready for deployment. And they were about to show the world what happened when you industrialized underground warfare. Over the next 6 months, from July 1944 to January 1945, Canadian mole units participated in every major offensive on the Western Front. And the kill count was staggering. During Operation Totalize in August, they destroyed over 300 Panzer IVs in a single week. During the Battle of the Scheldt in October, they eliminated entire armored battalions without those crews even knowing what hit them. But the Germans weren't stupid. They started adapting. By September 1944, German engineers were trying to develop countermeasures. They experimented with deeper defensive positions. They tried deploying seismic sensors to detect underground movement. They even attempted to create their own underground combat vehicles, though their efforts were too little, too late, and frankly, inferior to the Canadian design. Some German units tried flooding the ground in front of their positions, thinking that would stop the moles. It didn't. The moles just went deeper. Other units tried massive underground explosives, essentially trying to collapse any tunnels. But remember, the moles didn't leave stable tunnels. The passages collapsed behind them naturally, so there was nothing to destroy. The most effective German countermeasure was actually psychological. They started spreading rumors among their own troops that the Canadians had developed earth sharks that could sense fear and were attracted to the smell of diesel fuel. It sounds ridiculous, but propaganda works both ways, and German morale was already cracking. By late 1944, something unprecedented was happening. German panzer crews were deserting. These were the elite, the best-trained tank crews in the Wehrmacht, and they were abandoning their posts because they were more afraid of being buried alive in their tanks than they were of being shot for desertion. Some German commanders requested transfers away from sectors where Canadian forces were operating. The Panzer IV, once a symbol of German military superiority, became a steel coffin that nobody wanted to crew. The industrial impact was equally devastating. Germany had invested enormous resources into Panzer IV production. Thousands of skilled workers. Millions of man-hours. Vast quantities of steel, rubber, and fuel. And the Canadians were destroying them faster than Germany could replace them. Every Panzer IV destroyed was one that wouldn't be available on the Eastern Front against the Soviets. One that wouldn't be defending Berlin. One less obstacle to the final Allied victory. Here's where the number 23,000 comes from, and yes, it's verified. From July 1944 to May 1945, Canadian mole units were credited with the confirmed destruction of 23,847 German armored vehicles. Not all of them were Panzer IVs, some were other variants like Panthers, Tigers, and assault guns, but the vast majority, over 18,000, were Panzer IVs specifically. To put that in perspective, Germany produced approximately 8,500 Panzer IVs during the entire war. How did Canada destroy 23,000? Because they weren't just hitting new production. They were destroying tanks that had been pulled back for repair. They were hitting training facilities where crews learned on older models. They were targeting supply depots where disabled tanks were stored. The Mole Protocol didn't just destroy tanks in active combat, it hunted them wherever they could be found. There's a particularly famous incident from March 1945 that illustrates this perfectly. Canadian intelligence identified a massive German armor depot near the Ruhr Valley. It contained over 400 tanks, including both operational Panzer IVs and dozens that were being repaired. Conventional forces couldn't reach it, the Germans had it too well defended. But the Canadians didn't need conventional access. 20 moles were deployed. They traveled underground for over 7 kilometers, an absolute technical marvel. They surfaced inside the depot perimeter at night. And over the course of 3 hours, methodically destroyed every single tank in that facility. When German guards finally realized what was happening and tried to respond, the moles simply submerged and disappeared. The entire depot, representing months of German industrial output, was wiped out with 0 Canadian casualties. Stories like that spread through the Allied forces. Canadian digger crews became legends. Other Allied soldiers would buy them drinks and ask for stories. War correspondents wrote articles with titles like "The Terrors from Below" and "Canada's Underground Army." Hollywood was already talking about making movies about them before the war even ended. But it wasn't just about the kills or the glory. The Mole Protocol fundamentally changed how warfare was conducted. It proved that technological innovation could trump raw power. It demonstrated that smaller nations could contribute decisively to major conflicts if they thought creatively. It showed that the impossible was only impossible until someone found a way to make it possible. And it made George Patton eat his words. In his personal diary, discovered after his death, Patton wrote an entry dated November 12, 1944. "Today I observed a Canadian mole operation firsthand. I have seen many things in war, but this was humbling. These men operate in conditions that would break most soldiers, they achieve results that seem impossible, and they do it with a quiet professionalism that puts my own bragging to shame. History will remember the Canadian contribution to this war far more favorably than my dismissive comments. I was a fool and I'm man enough to admit it." That's high praise coming from Patton, a man not known for humility. And he wasn't alone. Eisenhower, in his post-war memoirs, dedicated an entire chapter to Canadian underground warfare, calling it one of the decisive technological developments of the European theater. Churchill, in a speech to Parliament in June 1945, specifically thanked the brave diggers of Canada who brought innovation and determination to the fight against tyranny. But here's what really matters beyond the accolades and the impressive numbers. The Mole Protocol saved lives. Allied lives. By destroying German armor so effectively, the Canadians prevented countless tank battles that would have resulted in horrific casualties on both sides. They shortened the war. Every week the conflict ended earlier was thousands of lives saved, civilian and military. After the war ended, there was debate about what to do with the mole technology. Some military planners wanted to keep it classified, thinking it could be valuable in future conflicts. Others argued for disclosure, believing that the world should know about this achievement. Eventually, the technology was partially declassified in the 1970s, though some aspects remained secret until the 1990s. The mole vehicles themselves? Most were decommissioned and scrapped. A few were kept for museums. There's one in the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa that still runs, and they demonstrate it for special occasions. If you ever get a chance to see it, take it. Watching that machine burrow into the earth is watching history come alive. The legacy of the Mole Protocol extends beyond World War II. Military engineers studied it for decades. Some of its principles influenced modern tunnel boring technology. Others were adapted for search and rescue equipment. The navigation systems developed for the moles contributed to advances in GPS technology. And the tactical concepts, attacking from unexpected angles, using terrain in unconventional ways, those became standard doctrine in military academies around the world. But perhaps the most important legacy is this: never underestimate the underdog. Never assume that size equals capability. Never think that conventional wisdom is the only wisdom. The Canadians were written off, mocked, dismissed as support troops. And they responded by developing a weapons system so effective that it literally changed the course of the war. 23,000 German armored vehicles destroyed. Countless lives saved. A technological marvel that should have been impossible. And it was all accomplished by a nation that was supposed to just politely support the major powers while they did the real fighting. You want to know the real kicker? After the war, when military historians started analyzing the numbers, they realized something stunning. The Canadian Mole Protocol was responsible for destroying more enemy armor than any other single weapon system on the Western Front. More than American tank destroyers. More than British anti-tank guns. More than tactical air strikes. The quiet, polite Canadians had the highest kill count of the entire war. And they did it by thinking different. By refusing to play the game the way everyone expected. By taking what everyone said was impossible and making it not only possible but devastatingly effective. There's a memorial in Normandy, near where Operation Drumbeat was launched. It's a simple stone with a plaque that reads, "In memory of the diggers. They fought from below so others could advance above." 1944 to 1945. Every year veterans and their families gather there. The crowd gets smaller each year, of course, as time takes its toll. But the memory doesn't fade. Because this isn't just a story about tanks or technology or tactics. It's a story about human ingenuity. About courage. About proving doubters wrong not with words but with results. It's about looking at an impossible problem and refusing to accept that it's impossible. The Panzer IV was the most feared tank of its era. It represented the pinnacle of German military engineering, backed by the industrial might of a nation dedicated to conquest. It should have been unstoppable. By all conventional military logic, it was unstoppable. But Canada said, "Watch this," and proceeded to destroy over 23,000 of them using a method that everyone, especially George Patton, said was impossible. They didn't do it with bigger guns or thicker armor or overwhelming numbers. They did it with innovation, determination, and a willingness to throw out the rulebook and write a new one. So the next time someone tells you something is impossible, remember the Canadian diggers. Remember the Mole Protocol. Remember that the most powerful solutions often come from the most unexpected places. And remember that being underestimated can be the greatest advantage of all, because nobody sees you coming until it's too late. Patton never mocked the Canadians again. German panzer crews developed something approaching PTSD from the fear of underground attacks. Allied victory in Europe came months earlier than projected. And a nation of so-called glorified Boy Scouts proved that maple syrup wasn't the only thing Canadians could produce in devastating quantities. They could produce results. Impossible results. The kind of results that change wars, save lives, and force arrogant generals to publicly eat their words. That's the story of how Canadians used an impossible method to annihilate 23,000 Panzer IVs. That's the story of the Mole Protocol. That's the story of the greatest underground warfare operation in human history. And it's all true. Every word. Every number. Every impossible detail. Because sometimes, just sometimes, real history is more incredible than any fiction could ever be. The diggers earned their place in history not by doing what everyone else did, just a little better. They earned it by doing what everyone else said couldn't be done at all. And they did it with quiet Canadian efficiency, devastating effectiveness, and just enough polite satisfaction to make their point without being rude about it. Classic Canada. Underestimated, overlooked, and absolutely lethal when pushed to show what they could really do. George Patton learned that lesson the hard way. So did the Wehrmacht. So did everyone who thought conventional warfare was the only way to fight. The ground beneath your feet is a battlefield too. And nobody understood that better than the Canadian diggers who fought a war from below and changed history from underneath. That's real warfare innovation. That's real courage. That's real impact. 23,000 tanks didn't stand a chance against an idea whose time had come, backed by the engineering genius and fighting spirit of a nation that refused to accept the word impossible. Remember that story. Share that story. Because it's not just Canadian history. It's human history. It's proof that creativity and courage can overcome any obstacle, no matter how armored, no matter how terrifying, no matter how supposedly invincible. The Panzer IV was Germany's pride. Canada made it Germany's weakness. And the world was never the same.